Welcome to the podcast on almost everything important. I'm Professor Raymond L. Williams, Distinguished Emeritus Professor of the University of California and author of 16 books on modern Latin American literature, mostly contemporary fiction. Today's podcast, which I'm also putting on YouTube, is on the theorist Walter Benjamin. This is the second podcast, so if you are a podcast listener, go ahead and check out the first one maybe before listening to this one. And also, if you're a YouTube viewer, you might want to check out these podcasts. You can find the total list of the podcast on SoundCloud, or in a more organized fashion, the 10 kinds of podcasts that we're doing, or the 10 series, are listed on the website www.thetop64.com. So this is our second podcast on Walter Benjamin. The first one was very introductory. As I mentioned when I was doing it, we could easily do, of course, 10 or 15 podcasts on Walter Benjamin and still only scratch the surface. The book we're talking about today, called The Arcades Project, is typically the kind of book we would spend an entire graduate seminar studying, because it's quite a book. This thing is 900 pages or more. Here's the cover. But what I wanted to do, you podcast listeners are going to have to be patient for a second while I show some pictures to the YouTubers. I wanted to show this picture here because this tells the story of the subject of the book. The subject of the book, as you can see from the picture, so maybe you podcasters are going to want to check out YouTube. Remind you, my name is Raymond L. Williams. The subject for the podcast is this book, The Arcades Project by Walter Benjamin. And I have a different take on this book than most of the people in the field. What's the field? Broadly speaking, I suppose the field is literary and cultural studies, or studies of theory, or all of the above. But maybe I'll start with a story. One of the things that impresses me about the popularity of Benjamin is, I was once having a conversation, I was recently telling a friend about actually, with a young professor of Latin American literature at a liberal arts college in the United States. We were at a conference and we were doing the normal introductions, names, where we teach, what our fields are. So since this was an assistant professor of Spanish, I asked him if he worked in Latin America, and he says, no, not really. And I said, so what do you work in? And he says, I work in Benjamin. I said, oh, okay. So what do you teach in your Spanish department? And he says, I teach Benjamin. And so I said, okay, so what do you read? And he says, I'm going to tell you the truth. I only read Walter Benjamin. And I found that really interesting. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast today, because, like I said, I have a different take on Benjamin. I know there are thousands and thousands of pages written on him, and I'm sure some of the academic viewers of this podcast have contributed some of those pages. So what I'd like to suggest is that the Arcades Project, which, as you've seen from the picture, has as its subject, its main subject, the original arcades, which were the 19th century commercial places that we might call shopping malls today. They were the predecessors of today's California shopping malls. And indoor shopping in an aesthetically pleasing environment. From what I've seen in the pictures of this book, it looks like the arcades in France, this is 19th century France, were actually a lot more aesthetically pleasing than most of our shopping malls. Actually, the cover also has another image. I'm going to put it up a little closer, of the arcades that Walter Benjamin was literally obsessed with for many years. There's a place in this book where he mentions, maybe it's the translators that mentioned this, that he studied, the research behind this book was a 13-year project. So this got me thinking, actually, that this has just from the start, this book has some commonality with books such as this. So here's my second visual image. For those of you that are listening to the podcast, I'm showing a visual image of Carlos Fuentes' novel, Terra Nostra, a Mexican novel published in 1975, that when we talk about it in Spanish, we have a term that's been used since the 1960s. It's still pretty popular, actually, not among theorists, but there has been theorized, the term has been theorized since Carlos Fuentes and Mario Vargas Llosa and Angel Rama popularized the term in the late 60s. The term was total novel, novela total. And so when we talk about novela total, we think first and foremost about novels such as Fuentes' Terra Nostra, and then more recently, we think of novels such as Roberto Bolaños' 2666, visual image of that. And then I need to give you the cross section, because these total novels, if they have one thing in common, it's they're big, right? These are long novels. And so these are different novelists' attempts to say everything about something. You know, they're totalizing. We don't use the term total novel in English, but we might refer to totalizing types of novels, and that's what we're thinking about. More recently, written in English, William Gass, The Tunnel, is something of a total novel. And Gass's The Tunnel, which I read fairly recently, or read parts of recently, got me thinking also about Walter Benjamin's Arcades Project. I'm just going to put right up front what I want to say about this. I think the Arcades Project is really more of a novel than an essay. And so let me put The Tunnel here on top of my stack to my left of total novels that are going to help me get into this subject of the Arcades Project as novel. Let me put it over there, but while I finish talking about, just reminding you in a way, if you're a Latin Americanist, you know about these novels. And if you're even a reader of English that's not, a reader of literature that's not maybe a professor of Latin American literature or a graduate student of Latin American literature, you might have heard of some of these novels. Here's one that's also, it might not look as big and totalizing, but it's very small print, and I guarantee you it's long and complex, because that's another commonality. These are all complex novels. They're not only long, but they're complex because they're trying to tell the total story, again, of something. So here's Grande Sertão Veredas by the Brazilian João Guimarães Rosa, another total novel. And then one you might not have heard of, even if you are a professor of Latin American literature, but look at that, just the gruesome, the size of this thing. This is Martín Caparrós, a living Argentine writer, and the novel is called La Historia. So it's the complete history of a subject. So this is our starting point. These are what we call total novels. And what I really think we have here in the case of the Arcades Project is a much better total novel than an essay. Because when it gets right down to it, it's not really an essay, you know. I mean, it doesn't have, to begin with, to be an essay. It needs a proposal. It needs a theory. And it's a book, fascinating book, as these other total novels are. Fascinating book, particularly if you're interested in arcades or 19th century French culture. But it's a book without any real proposal. It has nothing to prove, as actually none of these novels really have. The Tunnel is very comparable to the Arcades Project from the beginning, because we open this thing, the title is The Tunnel, and then here's the tunnel, and then there's a subsection called Life in a Chair. So if you're a reader of this, it's like, where are we? Life in a chair. So the narrator is supposedly this German professor. And it reminds me a lot of this. The narrator is a German professor that's got a lot of stuff to talk about. In both cases, they're both rambling novels that talk about a lot of very interesting stuff. But this isn't, Gas is the Tunnel, isn't really an essay because it has no proposal. It doesn't develop any argument, and it doesn't particularly get anywhere. It entertains us the way novels can. And ever since Tristram Shandy, another total novel, allowed novelists to talk about pretty much whatever they want, we have total novels. And so Gas did it. And then look at the beginning of this thing. Here it is. We have this supposed essay. And then it begins exposés, so exposés. And then there are other sections that are never really explained either. We can speculate what exposés are in different things, and I'm sure there are tons of things written that clarify all of this for us, supposedly. But this is all the stuff of what professors do as far as clarifying this. What we really have is a long, rambling novel. I find this discovery stunning because of the fact that we read Walter Benjamin so much as a theorist, as the young professor that I quoted earlier does. He finds this essay so stunning and complete, and along with the other essays of Benjamin, that he's actually abandoned the field of Latin American literature to teach Benjamin. There are other clues that Benjamin gives us along the way that he really wants to be a novelist. Excuse me, let me get a drink of water here. There are other clues, as I was saying, that Benjamin gives us that I guess you might call him a closet novelist, because the book is full of allusions to other total novelists that Benjamin had read. What stands out the most for me, the biggest giveaway for me really as a reader of total novels, because I should say, for those of you that know nothing about this Professor Raymond Dale Williams, author of 16 books, I have a special fascination with total novels, and most of my books have, in the end, most of my books have as centerpieces some kind of total novel. For example, my book supposedly on Carlos Fuentes really isn't about the fiction of Carlos Fuentes. It's called The Writings of Carlos Fuentes. It's really about this total novel that I showed you, Terra Nostra. But you can't really publish a book on one novel if you're a Latin Americanist, because the editors don't see it as marketable. So we had to call it The Writings of Carlos Fuentes to cover up the fact that it's really about a total novel called Terra Nostra. So, I had a special fascination for total novels. I've gotten to know some of these writers that have produced the total novels. They're all obsessive pieces of work. They're all the written production of obsessions. And in the case of Carlos Fuentes' Terra Nostra, it's a 15-year obsession. And in the case of Mario Vargas Llosa's Conversación en la Catedral, it's a 15-year obsession. From when the time the idea of the novel was born to when the book was produced. And as I mentioned, that's pretty much what happens with Benjamin. So the reason I'm telling you about my lifetime interest in total novels is that I'm pretty much aware of the fact that a large number of writers of total novels were inspired by Balzac in some way. And Balzac tends to be in the background, in the readings of these writers. Carlos Fuentes' eventual explanation of what he spent his life writing was actually paraphrasing Balzac and basically presenting his own work as kind of a parallel project to Balzac's complete work. So he set up at the end of near the end of his career, he started publishing at the end of his books kind of a scheme for his total novels, the totality of his novels, the way Balzac had. And Vargas Llosa, of course, was a big reader of Balzac. I don't know if William Gass was a big reader of Balzac. I tend to think, from what I know of Gass, probably less so than in the case of Fuentes and Vargas Llosa. But in any case, it's interesting to note that Walter Benjamin also quotes Balzac in this book. And if you look at the back of this thing, there's an appendix that the translators put into it, where you can quickly peruse a list of all the writers that Benjamin quotes in here, or to whom he refers, as well as an index. And the book is very literary. The Arcades Project, even though it's about a piece of architecture, basically, primarily, the arcades, it's really a very literary book. And the literature that interests Benjamin most obsessively is literature along the lines of the total novel. So, I wanted to start by basically saying, I want to start and close actually by saying, what I think is the best introduction to Walter Benjamin is to think of him as a novelist. And then you say, well, how could this be? Why would a distinguished theorist of culture want to be a novelist? And so I've been thinking about that question also, and it's obvious, in the following sense. A large number of accomplished human beings, whether they're academics or actors or athletes or whatever, often have the fantasy of being something a little different than what they are. And so let me remind you of this, because it's, like I say, it's actually kind of obvious, but I think it explains, but it's not that obvious, because I don't think, to my knowledge, anyone else has been seeing Walter Benjamin as a novelist. But it's very clear in my mind when I'm reminded, for example, my namesake, Raymond Williams, the British scholar who also has quite a reputation as a theorist of culture, actually aspired to be a novelist. And unlike Benjamin, he actually published a set of novels. And I know those of you that are real specialists in Raymond Williams, the British scholar, know that. A large portion of readers don't. But so that Raymond Williams, by the way, for those of you that have just run into this podcast and you're getting confused, there's a British scholar and cultural theorist named Raymond Williams, and I'm Raymond L. Williams, or Raymond Leslie Williams. So we're definitely different people. But in any case, let me remind you that top on my list among people that actually wanted to be novelists, that we don't think of as novelists, would be Raymond Williams, the British scholar, who actually published a set of novels. And then, we think about this a little more, and it's quite a list, actually. And then I remember a colleague at Washington University named Richard Watson, who is a very distinguished philosopher in the Department of Philosophy. But what Richard Watson really wanted to be was a novelist. And he eventually branched out into publishing some fiction near the end of his career at Washington University in St. Louis. But I think in the early stages of my academic career, I started discovering this, that more and more academics that had, such as Benjamin, that have worked a lifetime to establish an identity that's in some way scholarly, actually aspired to be far less rigidly theoretical than they really were, and just would have loved to be celebrity novelists. So let's go down the list. When I think of other celebrities, what did the famous NBA basketball player Michael Jordan really wanted to be? What really want to be? He wanted to be a baseball player. So this is the way it works. There's this fantasy that celebrity figures have, whether they're celebrity academics or whatever, to be the other. So Michael Jordan after his basketball career was over, what does he do? He goes out and goes into the minor leagues and starts playing baseball, only to discover, of course, that he's not actually a star in baseball at all, and his career just kind of fizzled out, and we all kind of forgot about it. Now he's the owner of a NBA basketball team. Or, the number of Hollywood actors that, the common person, such as myself or you and me, we might think they should be happy being celebrity actors, but no. They want to be baseball players, right? You invite them to go throw out the first pitch, and they'll show up and they'll try to hobnob with the players. And if they have any opportunity to play on any kind of celebrity exhibition game against real professional baseball players, they'll do it. So we got basketball players that want to be baseball players. We got theorists that want to be novelists. We've got Hollywood actors that want to be baseball players. You have the country musicians. They're famous. Do they want to be country musicians? Probably so. But what they really want to be is football players. You see the country musicians at the football games hobnobbing with the football players. If they get interviewed, they're going to tell stories about their high school football careers. They're going to claim that they're more passionate about football than singing country music. And so then it kind of goes on and on. For those of you that happen to know me well as an academic, what I know the best is the Colombian novel. And I know a lot of Colombian novelists. And I know their passions and their lives. What do the Colombian novelists really want to be? Most of them don't want to be Colombian novelists. They want to be Thomas Mann, right? They want to be German novelists, or maybe Polish novelists, And so you see where I'm going on this, is that it's not at all that surprising that Walter Benjamin really wanted to be a novelist. It's actually fairly common for successful academics, and particularly celebrity academics or celebrity actors or celebrity novelists or celebrity philosophers, to want to be the other, to be something else that they're not, some kind of celebrity that's more interesting for them. The intellectuals that I mentioned, Carlos Fuentes, Mario Vargas Llosa, and I'm going to add Walter Benjamin, really wanted to be Balzac. And that's kind of the conclusion to this podcast and to this YouTube, is that in the end, Benjamin, like Vargas Llosa and Carlos Fuentes, as far as I'm concerned, clearly really wanted to be Honoré de Balzac. So I think that actually, with that in mind, this thing reads a lot better, because as an essay, it doesn't really read that well. It's only kind of interesting it's only kind of good to read if you happen to be a specialist in Walter Benjamin. But if you're not a specialist in Walter Benjamin, such as the assistant professor I mentioned, who's a professor of Spanish at a liberal arts college, if you're not a big fan of Walter Benjamin, the book is kind of incoherent. It's kind of interesting in pieces, the way the tunnel is. But we're not worried about the tunnel being incoherent or Terra Nostra being incoherent, because the job of all of us who are readers of total novels is to find some coherence in it. And so I think the real work for the Arcades Project is finding the coherence of this total novel. To conclude, I wanted to point out another piece that's very similar to this, and what kind of started all this actually, and it dates back to the time when the time when Benjamin was doing this work. If we go back to the 40s to Jorge Luis Borges, and his essay his famous essay titled Pierre Menard, Autor del Quijote, you can do kind of the same thing with it, even though it's not a novel, but you can do kind of the same operation in the sense that if you really read Pierre Menard with an open mind, it's not really a short story. And so I used to like to pose to undergraduates, when I was teaching undergraduates was, to throw this story to sneak the story into a class without much explanation or preparation, let's say, and just see their initial reactions. And it was fascinating because the students were always perplexed, undergraduates were always perplexed with Pierre Menard, autor del Quixote. And then the main reason they were perplexed is that up until then, we would have been reading short stories. And if you really look at Pierre Menard, autor del Quixote, he doesn't really have much commonality with any kind of short story, whether it's traditional or modern or whatever you want to call it, because there's really no story. There's no story to Pierre Menard. And so you can back up and look at it and say, well, since it's not really a story, how are we going to read this? And if you read it as an essay, it has a lot of commonality with an essay, actually, because it's kind of an essay about Don Quixote and Pierre Menard. Of course, it's been used quite a bit and quoted quite a bit, actually, as a piece of theory, as kind of a theory of postmodern fiction, or a theory of quite a few things, actually, in modern theory of postmodern fiction, a theory of rewriting, a theory of post-romantic literature that it finds it impossible to be original. It's sort of a theory of originality. It kind of breaks down the suppositions about originality that we have about literature. So we have all these theoretical things in this story. It's kind of an essay. But to get back to the point with the Arcades Project, it's not actually a very good essay. Because as I remind the students, as I convince them that it's kind of like an essay, I remind them in that discussion, it's not really a good essay. If they turned in an essay like that, they'd probably fail, because the first thing the professor would say if they turned this in as an essay is it doesn't have a proposal, it doesn't have a theory, it doesn't have anything to prove. And so it just kind of works at some subjects the way novels tend to do. Again, The Tunnel works at several subjects. Terra Nostra works at several subjects. But none of these objects that I have here in my cluttered table where I typically do these podcasts, actually, none of these books has a theory of anything. You can construct some theories about literature and culture by reading any of these books, which is what we do. But in any case, I think the Arcades Project is best studied, actually, as a novel, and best reconsidered the way we reconsider the career of Michael Jordan and some of the country singers. That is, the career of someone that attained considerable success in the first half of their career, and then kind of just worked at a different kind of project the rest of their career, all of which leads us to the conclusion that the Arcades Project is kind of like a novel, a total novel that's kind of a representation of the failed academic career, or the frustrated academic career of a frustrated kind of closet novelist. So that's what I have on today's podcast on Almost Everything Important. If you want to see the other podcasts in our 10 series, you can refer to our website called www.thetop64.com, and you can find some of the other discussions like this on other YouTubes. And for those of you that want to know more about what this book actually contains, forthcoming is my podcast number 3 on the Arcades Project. Thank you very much. I'm Raymond Dale Williams of the University of California, and I've enjoyed this opportunity to chat with you.